In the vast theatre of World War II, there are aircraft that earned legendary status, their names spoken with reverence by historians and aviation enthusiasts alike. The British Spitfire, graceful and deadly, the American Mustang, the ultimate escort fighter, the Japanese Zero, the mysterious Phantom of the Pacific. But hidden among these giants, overshadowed by their fame, is a fighter that embodied both the brilliance and the fatal flaw of Japanese military thinking. The Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, known to Allied pilots by the codename Oscar, was a machine that could dance through the sky like no other aircraft in existence. It could turn tighter, maneuver faster, and outfly anything the Allies could throw at it in a dogfight. Yet this same aircraft, this marvel of aeronautical engineering, would become a burning coffin for thousands of young Japanese pilots who trusted their lives to its legendary agility. This is the story of how an obsession with dogfighting agility, cultural fixation on aerial combat as a test of warrior skill, doomed what could have been one of the war's finest fighters. Picture this. It's December 1937, and the Imperial Japanese Army has a significant and pressing problem. Their current frontline fighter, the Ki-27, is starting to show its age. Sure, it's nimble, sure it can turn on a dime, but there's a new war coming, and the generals know it. They need something better, something faster, something that can carry the fight to enemies they haven't even engaged yet. So they do something unusual. Instead of holding a competition between multiple manufacturers, they go straight to Nakajima Aircraft Company and hand them a challenge that would shape the future of Japanese air power. The specifications were demanding and challenging. The army wanted a fighter that could hit 311 miles per hour, climb to 16,400 feet in just 5 minutes, and have a range of 500 miles. But here's the catch. The part that would eventually seal the fate of thousands of pilots. The new fighter had to be at least as maneuverable as the beloved Ki-27, not just close, not nearly as good, just as maneuverable or better. This single requirement would become both the Hayabusa's greatest strength and its most devastating weakness. The man tasked with this challenge was Hideo Itokawa, a brilliant engineer who would later become famous as a pioneer of Japanese rocketry. But in 1937, he was just a young designer with an impossible task. He had to create a modern fighter with retractable landing gear and superior performance while maintaining the turning ability of a fixed-gear aircraft that weighed considerably less. It was like being asked to build a high-performance sports car that could corner like a lightweight bicycle. Itokawa and his dedicated team worked through the night, filling countless notebooks with calculations, building models, testing theories. They knew that maneuverability came from low weight and high lift. So they made a decision that would echo through the entire war. They would build the lightest fighter possible. Every gram would be scrutinized. Every component would be evaluated. If it wasn't absolutely essential, it was eliminated. Armor plating for the pilot. Too heavy. Self-sealing fuel tanks. They added weight. Heavy cannons. They'd slow the aircraft down. The philosophy was simple and deadly. Fly like an angel, turn like the devil, and trust that superior agility would keep you alive. The first prototype rolled out in January 1939 with great anticipation and excitement. When the test pilots climbed into the cockpit and took to the sky, their initial reaction was not what Itokawa hoped for. They landed with faces full of disappointment. The new fighter, they complained, wasn't much faster than the Ki-27, and worse, it actually felt less maneuverable. Can you imagine? After all that exhausting work, all those precise calculations, the new fighter seemed worse than what they already had. It was a disaster. But Itokawa wasn't ready to give up. Neither was Nakajima. They went back to the drawing board. Not once, not twice, but 13 times. 13 different prototypes, each one modified, each one refined, each one tested and evaluated. They trimmed weight wherever they could. They redesigned the fuselage, making it sleeker, slimmer. They moved the tail surfaces further back. They added a new canopy design. But the breakthrough, the innovation that would define the Hayabusa, came with the 11th prototype. Someone on the design team had a brilliant idea. What if they could increase the wing's effective area during combat without the permanent weight penalty of larger wings? What if they could deploy special flaps that would give the pilot more lift exactly when they needed it most during a tight turn? They called them butterfly flaps. Wide chord flaps that could be extended in combat to instantly increase lift and dramatically shrink the aircraft's turning radius. It was ingenious. It was revolutionary. And it worked. When test pilots flew the 11th prototype, everything changed. Suddenly, the Hayabusa came alive. With those butterfly flaps deployed, the aircraft could turn inside anything flying. Tighter than the Ki-27, tighter than the Navy's vaunted Zero. So tight that Allied pilots would later swear it defied the laws of physics. The 13th prototype combined all the improvements, the weight savings, the aerodynamic refinements, the butterfly flaps, and when the Army pilots tested it, they finally smiled. Production was approved in April 1941, and the Hayabusa was born. But here's what they didn't fully grasp in their excitement over that incredible turning ability. Here's what the obsession with dogfighting agility had cost them. The Hayabusa that went into production was a fighter with the structural integrity of tissue paper. To achieve that legendary maneuverability, Nakajima had stripped away everything that might keep a pilot alive in combat. The first production models carried just two 7.7mm machine guns. That's rifle-caliber weapons on a frontline fighter. For comparison, American fighters like the P-40 carried 6 50-caliber machine guns. British Spitfires had 8 guns. Even the Hayabusa's Navy cousin, the Zero, carried two 20mm cannons plus machine guns. The armour situation was even worse. There was none. 0. The pilot sat in the cockpit with nothing between them and enemy bullets except thin aluminum skin. No armoured backplate, no bulletproof windscreen, nothing. And those fuel tanks? They weren't self-sealing. One tracer round in the right spot and the whole aircraft would explode into a ball of flame. It was a time bomb waiting for a spark. The engineers knew this. They weren't fools, but they had their orders. Make it maneuverable, make it light, make it turn, and everything else was secondary. It was a design philosophy born from combat experience in China where Japanese fighters had faced obsolete Chinese aircraft and learned that the nimble fighter almost always won the dogfight. But the world was changing faster than Japanese military doctrine could adapt. When the Pacific War exploded in December 1941 with the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, only 40 Hayabusas had been delivered to combat units. The 59th and 64th Sentai, elite fighter squadrons staffed with some of Japan's most experienced and skilled pilots, took these gleaming new fighters to Burma and the Malay Peninsula. Their mission was critically provide air superiority for the Japanese invasion forces sweeping south through Southeast Asia, destroy Allied air power before it could organize effective resistance. And at first, in those early intoxicating weeks of conquest, it seemed like every assumption had been validated, every design choice justified. The Hayabusa was absolutely devastating in combat. It tore through British Brewster Buffaloes like a hawk tearing through sparrows, the American-built fighters proving hopelessly outmatched in turning combat. It danced circles around American P-40s, getting inside their turning radius and staying there, immune to their desperate attempts at evasion. Allied pilots who survived encounters with the Oscar, and many did not survive, reported the same thing over and over again in their debriefing sessions. Impossible maneuverability, could not keep it in their gun sights, turned so tight it seemed to violate the basic laws of physics and aerodynamics. The American volunteer group, the famous Flying Tigers, faced the Hayabusa in the skies over Burma and thought they were fighting Zeros. The resemblance was superficial, both had radial engines, both had bubble canopies, both could turn incredibly tight. But the Hayabusa was actually the Army's fighter, a parallel development that shared the same fatal flaw as its naval cousin. In the hands of experienced pilots against obsolete or equal opponents, it was absolutely lethal. Japanese aces racked up kill after kill. The top Hayabusa ace, Sergeant Satoshi Anabuki, would eventually claim 39 victories, 35 of them in the Oscar. But something was happening that would change everything. The Allies were learning, they were adapting, and they were bringing new aircraft into the fight. Aircraft that didn't play by the old rules. Aircraft that didn't try to dogfight the Hayabusa. Here's what Allied pilots figured out, probably faster than the Japanese High Command ever anticipated. You don't try to turn with an Oscar. You don't get into a circling knife fight, a traditional dogfight, where its phenomenal agility gives it the advantage every single time. Instead, you use what it doesn't have. You exploit its weaknesses rather than challenging its strengths. Speed, firepower, protection, armor, all the things the Japanese designers sacrificed in their pursuit of maximum maneuverability. American tactics evolved into something devastatingly simple, almost brutally efficient. Dive on the Hayabusa from above using superior altitude and speed. open fire with your 650 caliber machine guns, pouring a torrent of heavy bullets into the fragile airframe, and then critically keep going. Don't turn, don't climb, don't try to dogfight, just dive through, blast it with overwhelming firepower in that brief moment of contact, and zoom away using your superior speed and energy. The Oscar's light armament, those pathetic machine guns, couldn't hurt you during the brief moment you were in range. Its lack of armor meant even a short burst would tear it apart like tissue paper, and its relatively low top speed, sacrificed for that legendary turning ability, meant it couldn't catch you once you accelerated away in your dive. The results were predictable and horrifying. Allied pilots began reporting that Hayabusas exploded after just a few hits. The unprotected fuel tanks would ignite from a single tracer round. The lightweight structure would literally disintegrate under sustained fire. Wings would snap off, fuselages would break apart, pilots would be killed by bullets that would have barely scratched an armoured American pilot. One Allied pilot who captured a Hayabusa and flew it in mock combat tests summed it up perfectly. The Oscar had the best handling characteristics of any fighter in the war. It could turn and stall better than anything else. Low-speed acceleration was phenomenal. It was pleasant to fly with no vicious characteristics, but it was hopelessly outclassed by the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-38 Lightning, and even late-model P-40s. The maneuverability didn't matter when you exploded after the first burst of enemy fire. The Japanese tried to fix the problems. They really did. When the Ki-43-2 entered production in November 1942, it included some pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. The armament was upgraded to two 12.7mm machine guns, the equivalent of 50 caliber weapons. It wasn't much, but it was something. The problem was that these improvements added weight, which reduced the very maneuverability that was the Hayabusa's entire reason for existence. And even with the improvements, it still had a fraction of the firepower and protection of Allied fighters. Meanwhile, the Americans were bringing out monsters. The P-47 Thunderbolt weighed twice as much as the Hayabusa and carried 8 50 caliber machine guns. It was armoured like a tank and could dive like a meteor. The P-38 Lightning had 4 50 caliber guns and a 20mm cannon. Even the Navy's Corsair and Hellcat were armoured juggernauts compared to the delicate Oscar. These weren't fighters, designed for elegant aerial ballet. They were designed to kill quickly and efficiently, and then survive long enough to do it again. The combat statistics became a bloodbath. In the Burma-India theatre in early 1944, Hayabusa units were claiming victories, but they were paying terrible prices. Records show engagements where they'd shoot down a handful of Allied aircraft but lose a dozen of their own. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Japan was running out of experienced pilots, and the new replacements, rushed through abbreviated training programs, didn't have the skill to maximize the Oscar's agility advantage. They were just targets for Allied gunners. Picture a young Japanese pilot barely 20 years old, fresh from an increasingly abbreviated flight school program, climbing into his Hayabusa for the first time on an operational mission. The instructors have told him it's the most maneuverable fighter in the world, an aircraft that embodies the superiority of Japanese engineering and warrior spirit. He's been trained in the sacred art of dogfighting, drilled endlessly in the techniques of aerial combat, taught to see the one-on-one turning battle as the ultimate test of warrior skill and courage. He believes deeply in the Bushido Code, in the spiritual superiority of Japanese pilots over their American adversaries, in the idea that fighting spirit and skill can overcome any material disadvantage. He takes off from his base, his hand steady on the controls, joins his formation of Hayabusas flying in tight formation, and heads toward an interception of American bombers reported approaching the area. And then he sees them through the haze, 4 P-38 Lightnings, distinctive twin-boom fighters, diving down from 20,000 feet at over 400 miles per hour, their twin engines screaming as they plummet toward his formation. He tries to turn to meet them just as he was trained. He deploys his butterfly flaps, feeling the aircraft respond instantly. He pulls the stick back as hard as he dares, feeling the G-forces pressing him into his seat, confident in his aircraft's legendary maneuverability. And in that moment, as 8 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon from just the first Lightning open fire, as his unarmoured aircraft is torn apart by a storm of metal travelling at supersonic speeds, as his unprotected fuel tank ignites and turns his beloved fighter into a funeral pyre, as flames fill the cockpit and his world becomes nothing but searing pain, He understands the terrible truth that thousands of his fellow pilots have already learned. All the maneuverability in the world means absolutely nothing when you can't survive long enough to use it. The dogfight is over before it even truly begins. He doesn't even have time to scream before the end comes. This happened thousands of times. Thousands of young men trapped in fighters designed for a kind of war that no longer existed. The Japanese military knew what was happening. They weren't blind. Combat reports made it clear that the Hayabusa was outclassed. But the institutional obsession with agility, the cultural belief that superior fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages, the doctrine that had been developed over years of fighting in China, all of it worked against making the necessary changes. Efforts were made to develop better fighters. The Ki-44 prioritized speed and firepower over agility. The Ki-84 Hayate was a genuine match for American fighters. But these aircraft came too late and in too few numbers. Meanwhile, Hayabusa production continued. 5,919 aircraft were built, making it the second most produced Japanese fighter after the Zero. Most of these were produced after it was already clear the design was obsolete. The crews who maintained these fighters knew the truth. They worked miracles to keep them flying, salvaging parts from wrecked aircraft, improvising repairs with whatever materials they could find. They watched young pilots climb into cockpits and fly off to certain death. They understood that the beautiful, nimble fighters they were sending into battle were fundamentally unsuited for the war they were fighting. By mid-1944, the situation was desperate. American B-29 superfortresses were beginning to raid the Japanese home islands, flying at altitudes where the Hayabusa could barely operate. The lightweight fighter struggled to climb to the bomber's cruising altitude, and when it got there, its two machine guns were pathetically inadequate against the heavily armoured Boeing giants. Pilots had no choice but to attempt ramming attacks, sacrificing themselves and their aircraft to bring down a single bomber. It was insane, it was wasteful, it was the logical endpoint of a design philosophy that had prioritized agility over everything else. In the final months of the war, many of the remaining Hayabusas were expended in kamikaze attacks. Pilots would load them with bombs and fly them straight into Allied ships, turning the nimble dogfighter into a guided missile. It was perhaps the ultimate irony. An aircraft designed for the artistry of aerial combat, for elegant turning battles and skilled maneuvering, reduced to a simple suicide weapon. All that beautiful agility, all those butterfly flaps, all that careful engineering, it all ended the same way, in fire and destruction. One surviving Hayabusa pilot, Lieutenant Saburo Hayashi, later reflected on his experiences. He described the aircraft as wonderful to fly, responsive and forgiving, capable of maneuvers that seemed impossible. But he also described watching friend after friend die in flames, watching skilled pilots killed by single bursts of enemy fire, watching the best fighter pilots in Japan reduced to desperate suicide attacks because their aircraft couldn't protect them. When asked if he would want to fly the Hayabusa again, he said something that should haunt anyone who studies this aircraft. He loved the plane, but he would never forget that it was designed to sacrifice the pilot for an advantage that stopped mattering. The numbers tell the brutal truth. Against early Allied fighters and obsolete aircraft, the Hayabusa maintained a positive kill ratio. Against the Curtiss P-40 in the hands of inexperienced pilots, against the Brewster Buffalo, against Hurricanes flown by pilots who didn't understand the Oscar's capabilities, it did well. But against the later war American fighters, against the P-38s and P-47s and P-51s, against the Corsairs and Hellcats, the exchange rate collapsed. For every Allied fighter the Hayabusa shot down, the Allies shot down 5, sometimes 10 Oscars. Their math was inexorable. Japan was losing pilots faster than they could train them, and the Hayabusa was a major reason why. What makes this tragedy even more poignant is that it didn't have to be this way. The Japanese had talented engineers. They had industrial capacity, at least in the early war. They had pilots who were among the best trained in the world. If they had designed the Hayabusa differently, if they had prioritized survivability alongside maneuverability, if they had understood that the future of air combat lay in energy tactics and firepower rather than turning battles, the Pacific Air War might have looked very different. Imagine a Hayabusa with armor protection, with self-sealing tanks, with 4 20mm cannons. Yes, it would have been less agile, but it would have been survivable. It would have been effective. Its pilots might have lived long enough to use their skill, but that's not the aircraft that was built. The aircraft that was built was a testament to the danger of fighting the last war instead of the next one. It was proof that doctrinal obsession can override practical reality. It demonstrated that sometimes being the best at what you do isn't enough if what you do no longer matters. The Hayabusa could outturn any fighter in the sky, but in a war where turning meant dying, that ability became a liability rather than an asset. After the war, captured Hayabusas were evaluated by Allied engineers and pilots. Their reports were consistent. Beautiful aircraft, excellent handling, utterly obsolete by the standards of late war fighters. Some were used briefly by French forces in Indochina, where they fought against Viet Minh rebels who had no air force of their own. In that environment, against ground targets and without air opposition, the Oscar was perfectly adequate. But those were not the conditions it had been designed for or the war it had fought. Today, only one complete Hayabusa survives. It sits in a museum, a relic of a different time, a different philosophy of war. Visitors can look at its clean lines, its compact design, its butterfly flaps still visible on the wing. They can read the specifications and imagine how it must have felt to fly such a responsive, agile aircraft. But they should also remember the thousands of young men who flew it into battle, who trusted their lives to its maneuverability, and who died when that maneuverability proved insufficient against the brutal realities of industrial age warfare. The legacy of the Hayabusa is complex. On one hand, it was the most numerous fighter of the Imperial Japanese Army, serving on every front where the army fought. It produced more aces than any other Japanese army fighter. In the hands of skilled pilots, under the right circumstances, it was absolutely lethal. Those butterfly flaps really did work, really did give it a turning radius that Allied pilots found almost unbelievable. As a technical achievement in lightweight fighter design, it was remarkable. But on the other hand, it represents one of the great failures of military aviation in World War II. Not a failure of engineering or aerodynamics. Those were actually quite brilliant, but a failure of doctrine, of understanding, of adaptation. The Japanese military establishment that created the Hayabusa was so committed to the ideal of the maneuverable dogfighter that they couldn't see how the nature of air combat was changing. They built an aircraft optimized for a style of warfare that was already becoming obsolete, and they kept building it long after its weaknesses had become fatally obvious. The Hayabusa killed more Allied aircraft than any other Japanese army fighter, but it also killed more Japanese pilots through its fundamental vulnerability to the weapons and tactics that came to dominate the Pacific Air War. Every one of those 5,919 aircraft jets represented a choice, a decision to prioritize agility over protection, maneuverability over firepower, the dream of the perfect dogfighter over the reality of modern combat. In the end, Japan's obsession with dogfighting agility didn't just doom the Hayabusa. It doomed the pilots who flew it, the squadrons that depended on it, and ultimately contributed to the defeat of Japanese air power in the Pacific. The Oscar could dance through the sky like no other fighter. But when the music stopped and the shooting started, all that grace and agility couldn't save it from the hard truths of war. Sometimes, the most maneuverable aircraft is just the one that gives the enemy more time to shoot at it. Sometimes, the fighter that turns the tightest is just the one that stays in the kill zone longest. And sometimes being the best at dogfighting means nothing when your enemies have stopped dogfighting altogether. The Hayabusa was designed to fly like an angel and turn like the devil. Instead, it became a burning coffin for an entire generation of Japanese pilots, a monument to the fatal cost of fighting yesterday's war with yesterday's assumptions and yesterday's tactics. The aircraft itself was not inherently bad. The engineering was actually quite impressive. The aerodynamics were sound. The butterfly flaps were genuinely innovative. But the philosophy behind it, the obsession with dogfighting maneuverability above all other considerations, that philosophy killed thousands of young men who deserved better from their leaders and their engineers. That's the real story of how Japan's obsession with dogfighting doomed what could have been their best fighter. Sometimes the greatest strength can become the greatest weakness when the rules of engagement change beneath your feet.